measures by investing in independent domestic violence, independent sexual violence advisors to ensure that victims and survivors of the crime of rape have people in whom they can confide and trust throughout that miserable period when they're in the criminal justice system. And another thing we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is recruiting record numbers of police officers. And I'm proud to say that 40% of our new recruits are female, Mr. Speaker, which I believe will be a great consolation and use to those who are victims and survivors of rape.
Starmer.
What an appalling answer. I asked him why 98.4% of cases aren't getting into the system, and he talks about a sentence. That is the problem. If the Prime Minister thinks that's the answer, that is why we've got these terrible rates of conviction and of prosecution. The answer is there's nothing in that bill. The truth is victims of rape are being failed. Now, Mr. Speaker, they're not just my words, they're in the government's own report. Victims of rape are being failed. There's no escaping that appalling figure, Prime Minister. 98.4% of rape cases ending without anybody being charged. And those that do get in the system take years to go through. Does the Prime Minister accept that cuts to the criminal justice system have contributed to that appalling situation?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, because we've increased the numbers of people in the CPS by at least 200, Mr. Speaker, specifically dedicated to helping to prosecute the crime of rape and sexual violence. And, Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely determined to stamp it out. This is a problem that has been going worse because of the evidential difficulties caused by the data recovery process and the lack of unity, the lack of joined-up thinking between all parts of the criminal justice system. That is something that this government is now addressing by more investment, by putting more police out on the street, and also by having tougher sentences. And finally, it would be good to hear him support it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I spent 5 years as Director of Public Prosecution prosecuting thousands of rape cases. I don't need lectures, but I do know the impact of cuts on our criminal justice service. The government can't make cuts, significant cuts to the Crown Prosecution Service, 25% cuts to the Ministry of Justice, close half the courts in England and Wales, yes, half the courts, and now pretend that a small budget increase will solve the problem. But, Mr. Speaker, this is more than just about cuts. The rate review is welcome, but it's weak. The Victims Commissioner, the government's Victims Commissioner, described the review as underwhelming. It could have been 10 times stronger. That review is littered with pilots and consultations on proposals that have literally been discussed for years and years. It is so unambitious. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that despite these shameful figures, and they are shameful, the government still isn't showing the urgency needed to tackle the epidemic of violence against women and girls?
Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, because we've also brought in the landmark domestic violence bill, which, again, it would have been good if we'd had wholehearted support from the Labour Party opposite. And, Mr. Speaker, no, because this government has brought in much tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. And he can't, no matter how much he wriggles and squirms, Mr. Speaker, he can't get away from the simple fact that on a 3-line whip, he got his party to vote against tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. That, Mr. Speaker, is weak.
Keir Starmer.
You can always tell when he's losing, Mr. Speaker.
I want both sides. It's a very, very emotive and important issue. I need to hear the question and the answers. I certainly don't expect shouting from the backbenches. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, on the Prime Minister's watch, rape prosecution convictions are at a record low. Court backlogs are at a record high. Victims are waiting longer for justice, and criminals are getting away with it. This wasn't inevitable. It's the cost of a decade of Conservative cuts. And even now, the government isn't showing the urgency and the ambition that's needed. Mr. Speaker, the Justice Secretary has done the rarest of things for this government and apologised. But I note the Prime Minister hasn't done that today. It's time he did, that he took some responsibility and backed it up with action. Will he do so?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I said to the right honourable gentleman, and I fought to have